Konnichiwa. I am very grateful to Hitotsubashi University and to Professor Takashi Machimura for inviting me to speak to you. I am also very grateful to all of you for allowing me to speak in English. This is very kind of you because my Japanese is limited to about 10 words, I regret to say. So I will speak to you about some of the trends and changes that I have observed in New York and other big cities of the world during the past 20 years. Some of the trends are, I believe, universal trends, but perhaps they are different or they play out differently in different places according to specific geographies, politics, and environmental reasons. One of the issues that I have been concerned with in recent years, and especially in the book Naked City that Professor Machimura has mentioned to you, is the issue of authenticity. Many of my colleagues are concerned with the same problems, but in different names. For example, justice, equality, diversity. But I have chosen to speak about these issues in terms of authenticity. Perhaps you will agree that this is a good word to use, or perhaps you will say, no, this is not a good word. But you can see from the title that I want to contrast the power of the corporate state and the corporate economy with a more democratic, more equal, more culturally diverse and creative set of experiences that comes from underneath the top of society. So let's see if we can use a common language to talk about cities today. First is the element of structure. What is the common structure of cities today? And I will just mention some of the common frameworks of structure that we all use. Number one, neoliberalism, which means somewhat different policies in different societies of the world. But I think the single common element of neoliberalism is that there is a conflict between the state taking responsibility for the good of the population and the individual taking responsibility for the good of the individual. And this is the source of many of the conflicts in politics in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and in other societies of the world. Global integration, I think I do not need to define how interconnected the economies and cultures of different regions of the world have become during the past 40 years. And integration to this extent threatens the autonomy of each individual national state and each individual local unit of the state. And then, of course, there is the element of scarcity. By this I mean environmental and economic scarcity, so that we are constantly searching for the future sources of survival of humanity. So much for structure. In terms of a common framework of institutions, we have states which are more or less nationalist. I speak of all of our nation states in this way, states that are trying to promote aggressively the interests of their elites and their industries in the rest of the world. Also, I think there's a common element of distrust in government, a feeling among people that the state does not really represent them, a feeling that neither political parties nor the objective institutions of society, such as the courts, will allow their group to survive, whatever their group may be, whether it's a religious group, a language group, a political group, or a social class. Then I think we have a common institutional framework based on large corporations that are increasingly transnational, or at least trans-regional, which are, at the moment and for the past few years, feeling some of the very negative effects of competition, which forces them to become not less aggressive, but perhaps more geographically limited and more strategically limited than they have been. I think, for example, of some Japanese banks and manufacturers which are now pulling out of European and global competition and concentrating more on East Asian collaborations and investment strategies. And then I think about how the competitive position of the labor force in most countries of the world has become worse in recent years, how salaries have declined, how the purchasing power of workers has declined, and how the autonomous organizations of labor have been very threatened by the corporate economy. And then when we come down to the geographical level of cities, I think that cities have become much more standardized or homogenized in the past 20 years. That is, that cities have become more the same than they were before. First, in terms of the cities being developed on a corporate scale in which the developers, the builders, even the architects are transnational corporations, and the scale is much larger in terms of individual buildings and districts, and even cities. I know Tokyo has been a very large city, a mega city compared to United States cities for a long time. But now we see every city that wants to be a global city trying to become larger, to have more population, taller buildings, more weight in some sense. So I call this a corporate scale of development. I also think that cities have become much more alike in the motivation of city governments, developers, and builders to create more expensive space. And third, I think that cities have all become more polarized in recent years. Every city, of course, has had rich people and poor people, but I think the social polarization has become worse in recent years, and I think the social polarization has become more visible in recent years, so that the polarization has become naturalized, we say. That means that many people believe that it is natural to have very rich districts of the city and very poor districts of the city, and they don't question this. And then there is a third category after structure and institutions, which I think must be brought into our discussions of cities, and that is experience. What is the experience of normal, ordinary men and women? What do we feel? What do we see? How do we emotionally work to identify ourselves in cities? And how do we identify ourselves with cities? And I generally think about urban experience as being visible in the built environment, the districts of cities, the streets, the public places, the buildings. I also think increasingly that people, especially young people, but even older people like me, we see the city more in terms of what we read about the city in online media. So that if I want to find a store, or I want to find a restaurant, or I want to go out to find entertainment, sometimes I look online instead of just walking with my feet. And especially among young people, when they want to meet, first they meet in social media, and then they meet face-to-face. And in fact, one of the main uses of social media is to meet face-to-face. In Naked City, I write a little bit about how people describe their neighborhood in online blogs, and specifically blogs about real estate and apartments. This might be more true in American cities, certainly in New York, but I think increasingly we tend to perceive the world first virtually and then by walking, and that's just a layer of experience that we have to analyze if we are writing about cities. But third, urban experience is created and recreated over time in small-scale spaces that are local, that integrate people, even strangers who do not know each other, in terms of their everyday routines, whether those routines mean going to a shop to buy something to eat, or going to a cafe or a bar or a club, or going to a store, or standing on the street to talk to other people. I'm very interested, almost like an anthropologist, in the way local spaces create ecosystems that reproduce the identities of neighborhoods and districts. So all of the elements of experience are important for us to understand when we write about cities. So let's look at how these things look. Corporate scale, how do we experience corporate scale? Certainly there are tall buildings in all of our cities, but we walk around these tall buildings, and we feel that they are part of our landscape because they are constantly being built and rebuilt around us. We shop in corporate landscapes so that the names of these shops become more familiar to us than the names of families that might own shops on the street where we live. We see signs. Let's see if I can just kind of get the cursor to move here. We see signs around us which in New York say, real estate capital of the world. What does this mean for someone who is just living in the city? It means that when I walk around, I feel that I am part of a speculative economy, right? It becomes part of my experience of the city. And then we see individual signs. Now, I have become a very dangerous person now that I take all of my own pictures with my own camera, because I'm constantly taking photographs and then trying to interpret them and say, what did I really see here? So in this photograph, which is just a photograph of a sign on an empty office building in New York City, you see how the landscape of the corporate landscape of the city becomes part of what I read in the language of every day. So that in this sign, we see the name Bryant Park underneath the numbers 475. And this is in fact a public park which is near this building, but the redevelopment of the park has created a new name for the entire district, so that the real estate developers profit from the investment in the infrastructure of the park, and the name of the park becomes a valuable name for the property development. Then we have this phrase, flagship retail, which means a very big corporate-owned chain store, say H&M, something like that. And the words flagship retail become, again, part of my landscape of the city, even though they really are a kind of promotion for property development. The same thing with headquarters office. Now we understand that most cities try to compete to have headquarters of major corporations. But this becomes, the very language headquarters office becomes part of my landscape, even though I have no economic interest in office headquarters. But that becomes part of what I experience as the city. Most immediately, however, are these words down here in the lower right-hand corner, TIAA. That is my pension system. That is the U.S. pension system of university professors. So I am really immediately interested in this property development, because if I want to have money to live on after I retire from being a professor, I must understand that this building should be a success. So, you know, the very sign suggested so many things to me about how to understand the city. What is my experience of the city? In a very real way, I become an investor in the speculation of the city. And then, of course, the polarization we see every day. I took both of these photographs on Fifth Avenue in New York City, where you have two very different sorts of retail entrepreneurs. You have the individual entrepreneur who sells T-shirts on the sidewalk, and then, of course, you have the transnational corporate entrepreneur. In a shop window, you have a picture of elegance and luxury with the clothing. But if you look over here at the sign, you see this is a little promotion of the Red Cross. It's a nonprofit organization that collects money for victims of earthquake and storm and other natural disasters. But this is just part of the experience of the city. At the same time, at the very same moment, when you look at the luxury in the shop window, you also look at the dependence and the charity of the Red Cross. The contrast that I would like to draw is between the corporate experience of the city and authentic experience of the city. And I've become somewhat well known for using the word authentic to speak about cities. But the first thing I have to say is it's not only my word, it's a word that is used frequently in advertisements these days. It's a word that has everyday meaning to a lot of people. It's not an academic word. It's also not a political word like justice. So that if you talk about the authentic city, there's really not an automatic assumption that you're talking about social justice. It's more a language of culture that reaches more people than a language of justice. Maybe that's bad, maybe that's good, but I think that's the way the language is. So what is it? Authenticity is a word that has many different meanings. It has all of these meanings. From the 18th century in Europe, the word authenticity meant something that is natural, like in nature, in contrast to society, right? It's something that's free and open and part of the natural world. From the 19th century, the word authenticity took on a meaning of reality. It's something that is real and often something that is connected with the lower class, in contrast to the upper class, which is fake and pretentious, in contrast to the real people. In the 20th century, the word authenticity took on a meaning that has to do with historic buildings, old districts, which have survived fires and earthquakes and wars, that are very old. Then there's a meaning of authenticity that some people think of as something that is forever true. It's permanent. It never changes. The German sociologist Theodor Adorno wrote about authenticity, though, that it can also exclude people. It can repress, because authenticity suggests that there is one group of people who know what is real and true. and they represent the real people. And there is a sense of repressive purity in the word authenticity when it is used in that way. But I like to use authenticity in the last sense, that authenticity means people have a right to make a home where they want to live and not to be displaced by rents, not to be displaced by redevelopment, not to be displaced by speculative property owners. And these are very real dangers in New York City, in London, and in some other cities in the world. I'm not sure whether this is as serious a problem in Tokyo, but in New York, to remain in place is very difficult as the price of housing rises. So I chose to use authenticity, most importantly, to speak of people's right to stay in their home if they want to stay in their home and not to be forced to leave. Some people connect that risk with gentrification, but the general force to leave is an economic force to leave in New York. There's also a question of who is the real source of authenticity, and this was just a photograph I took a few weeks ago in New York of some men who found a statue on the street by chance. But when I was looking at the photograph later, I realized that it speaks to the very real question of morality in authenticity. If you speak of authenticity, then somebody has the moral right to say, this is authentic, and that is not authentic. So there is a real element of power in using the language of authenticity. There's also another problem with using authenticity. It's a problem of the very word. It has an ambiguity or a duality built into it, at least in the English language, because authenticity can mean two very different kinds of phenomena. On the one hand, authenticity means something that is very original, very innovative, very new, but it also means something that is very old. And you can use the word authentic in both senses. For example, if we speak about an artist or a musician, and we say his work is really authentic, we often mean his work or her work is so new. The person is a genius. The artist is a genius. And that's a very individual kind of creativity. But if we speak of authenticity in the sense of historic, we usually speak of it as a group product. A society or a culture creates something so long ago that we don't even know when it originated. So it's very, very old. And it's part of the term authenticity that it means two very different things, very old and very new. And I actually like this ambiguity and I like this duality because to me that represents what is truly great about cities. In cities you can find that which is very, very old and that which is very, very new. And it's that difficult balance between old and new that I find most important in cities, but it's also a balance that's very difficult to achieve. So when I tried to think of visual images of authenticity, I thought about the duality of interdependence and diversity, and also about the duality of spontaneity and tradition. All four of these terms are very typical of cities. Interdependence. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to take some pictures during a recent crisis in New York City. When the city is dark and we no longer have the electricity, that illuminates everything and makes everything seem the same, then we really discover how dependent we are on other people. We're dependent on people like the police to light a little fire in the street so we can see where to walk. We're dependent on some people coming to set up computer stations on the street so we can communicate when we have no cell phone service and no computers. And you can even see a Toshiba laptop here in the computer station. These were pictures that I took during the recent hurricane in New York City when we had no electricity and water for several days. But we also have great diversity in cities. Certainly in New York we have more diversity than in many other cities. Here in terms of old and new residents of one neighborhood of Brooklyn, where you have on the left side older people who have lived in the neighborhood for years on a summer's afternoon, sitting on the street and just speaking with their friends. A few blocks away, we see new residents of the same neighborhood, Muslim women in their hijab in front of a small supermarket. And what's particularly interesting is not only that these women are not African American or Caribbean American, they're from a completely different ethnic group, religious group, region of the world, but also that they're going into this shop when the shop sells pork sandwiches. So there's, you know, quite a diversity and interdependence in the very same neighborhood. But part of the city is also spontaneity, where on the sidewalk in front of a park, people, in this case young men, which I think is very interesting, can just start jumping rope in the middle of the afternoon. It's, again, part of the city's authenticity. And this is a picture that I took in Tokyo in the 1990s, and which I probably understand differently from any of you. And I think I showed it to Caro many years ago, and Caro immediately read the photograph in terms of the Coca-Cola sign, and I was reading it in terms of the greeting between the shopkeeper and the person in the street. So again, you know, how you interpret the experience of the city is a reflection of your own experience. And my experience in Tokyo is limited than any of your experience in Tokyo. But to me, this is a visual image of tradition in a city. In my own neighborhood, tradition looks more like this. And this was a bar which was displaced by force in the past year to build a tall apartment house. So in order to make a better city, I think that we have to cultivate people's desire for authentic urban experience in all of these contradictory ways, so that we ourselves as individuals have to balance the situation that exists and the situation that should be. But we cannot assume that what is what should be, and we cannot assume we know what should be without knowing what is. I think we also have to embrace at the same time the very old in cities and the very new. And we cannot try to rebuild cities completely as new cities. Neither can we try to preserve the city entirely as an old city. Again, each of these points concerns the difficulty of making a balance between very different situations. I think that we have to build on people's desire to have a deep experience in cities, an experience of enchantment, as the classical European sociologists, Max Weber, for example, wrote in the early 20th century about the disenchantment of modernity. I think we have to re-enchant cities, but emphatically not re-enchant in the commercial Disneyland model, but to find non-commercial ways to re-enchant the city. I think we have to go out of our way to make sure that urban cultures are diverse in terms of rich and poor, in terms of different ethnic groups, different regional groups, different language groups, because this also makes a city a more emotional experience for people living in it. Again, I think we have to fight against forced displacement from cities. We have to make sure that there are not economic reasons, not political reasons, and undoubtedly not environmental reasons for people to lose their homes. So one unit to look at to reproduce urban experience, as I said a few minutes ago, is the unit of a local cultural ecosystem, where you have various factors. You have a factor of local identity, or what I like to call local DNA in my genetic language. I would define an ecosystem as a shared network that brings people together in every possible way. I think that local cultural ecosystems are embodied in the built environment, as I said earlier about urban experience. These ecosystems are enforced by everyday sociability that we're not really conscious of, but we engage in the routines of sociability. Many of these ecosystems are emplaced in public spaces. They may be a street, they may be a park, they may be a restaurant, a bar, a club, places that in English we call sometimes third spaces. They're neither private nor public, they're in between private and public. And Professor Machimura has been working with me on a research project for the past 2 years in which, and Professor Hattori, also sitting next to Professor Machimura, we've been looking at local shopping streets as cultural ecosystems. And this is one street where I've done research in Amsterdam. It's just a normal street. You don't think anything special about this street. And yet, if you really study the street, you see how people relate to each other as part of a shared routine. There's a small scale, a local scale. There is a sense that this is part of your identity, that you live every day, that you experience every day. It's partly traditional, partly new. So the advantages of a cultural ecosystem are that they do what the sociologist C. Wright Mills said we sociologists should do. They integrate social structure and individual lives, but they also integrate them through material culture, through buildings, through objects, through transactions. And yet they're challenged. I mean, just to show you the picture of the local shopping street, reminds you how old-fashioned that kind of routine may appear. They're challenged by new forms of mobility, where we have people who migrate from different regions of the world. We have people who migrate every day on trains and bicycles and automobiles from place to place. We have people who move from home to home in different places. We have the sorts of forced displacement that I mentioned several times already in connection with New York. When rents or housing prices become so expensive, people can no longer afford to remain in their local cultural ecosystem. They must move elsewhere. New social media, again, also makes local ecosystems depend on more distant and more virtual forms of communication. Sometimes social media can make a local cultural ecosystem so popular that outsiders come in and the local ecosystem becomes more of an entertainment center or a commercial center than a network for local people. Also the redevelopment of all of our cities, which tears apart small stores, small streets, low buildings, and rebuilds them as very big spaces, threatens the local cultural ecosystem. It's very difficult to create an ecosystem when people are living vertically rather than horizontally. So the thought that I would want to discuss with you would be how to strengthen local cultural ecosystems. What can we do so that we no longer have all of the dangers that I've talked about, so that we make sure that people can be attached to place, so that more public spaces of between public and private are created, so that people can work and live in the same place. So we don't have a closed sense of national culture or local culture, but we can embrace new people coming into old places. Again, control the economic factors of displacement. And most importantly, we should allow local communities to reject new projects of development. I'm sure Tokyo has the same problems with local communities participating in the development process, but never having the power to reject a development project. I would be interested to hear how this works in Tokyo. In every society that I have visited, there is always an effort to make a more democratic, more participatory system of urban planning. But what usually happens is that the big developers and the city government make a plan and they listen to the public, but at the end of the process, they build what they want to build, and there are very few compromises that are made. I think New York City has a fairly democratic system of participation of the public in a series of public meetings to discuss big development projects. And there is also an environmental impact study that must be made for all big development projects. But at the end of the process, what happens all the time is that the big project is built. Well, I shouldn't say all the time. There have been a few examples where big projects have not been accepted, usually when the media enter into the battle and criticize the big development project. For example, I noticed on the way to the university this afternoon that Tokyo is going to try to compete to hold the Olympics here in 2020. Urban sociologists and urban economists usually say that it is not economically effective for cities to have these big mega projects. The mayor of New York City, Mayor Bloomberg, proposed that New York compete for the Olympics, and you know we did compete for, what's it, the 2016 Olympics. Many people in New York were opposed to that, but the city government continued to press for that. We were very lucky that we lost the bid to Rio, but it was Rio, yes? Rio? To London, sorry, no, that was the next one, Rio, I think, to Rio. But that's the sort of project where the public can speak and speak and speak, but nobody listens. At the end, nobody listens, unless usually in the United States, if the media enter into the criticism, it becomes a much more powerful criticism. So, you know, I don't think any society in the world has developed a good system where local communities can reject new development projects. So what I would like to see is that we no longer have the picture on the left, but we have the picture on the right. And I should explain to you that in the picture on the left, I was actually inside, I was inside the gate because that was a party that an art museum made to celebrate an event that they were doing, and yet, you know, just outside, the real city was sitting. The picture on the right is a woman who is an urban farmer in a neighborhood in Brooklyn where there is some empty space that has been turned into community gardens and urban farms. And so she is growing those greens in Brooklyn and selling them at a farmer's market on Saturday. So when we talk about an urban cultural ecosystem, I really understand that to be an ecosystem in a social sense, a cultural sense, and an economic and environmental sense. And this is the vision of the city that I think is most authentic. So I would be very interested to hear what you think. Thank you. ありがとうございます。